People like you should stay invisible. The words didn't echo, they settled, heavy and quiet, over the soft clink of crystal and low jazz humming through the private dining room on the 42nd floor, where every chair cost more than a month's rent, and every glance carried weight. And Daniel Whitmore didn't even look up when he said it, adjusting his cufflinks, eyes fixed on a contract worth over $200 million, as if the woman standing beside him was just part of the furniture, just another shadow in a pressed uniform. But Ava Johnson heard every syllable, not because it was loud, but because it was familiar, painfully precise, like a memory replaying itself without permission. And for a brief second, her hand paused midair with the bottle of Cabernet, her reflection trembling in the glass, because 8 years ago, under a broken streetlight outside a downtown office building, soaked in rain and holding a folder full of dreams she thought might change her life, she had heard those exact same words, spoken in that same calm, dismissive tone, from the same man who now sat inches away and couldn't even recognize her face. And the room around them continued as if nothing had happened, executives murmuring about projections, a server laughing softly near the bar, city lights stretching endlessly beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows like a promise only some people were allowed to touch. But Ava stood still in the middle of it all, carrying not just a tray, but a history Daniel Whitmore had long forgotten, a history that had shaped every step she took since that night, every job she worked, every door that closed before she could even knock. And Daniel, the billionaire who built his empire on precision and control, on never missing a detail that could cost him money, had missed the one detail that now stood right in front of him, breathing, watching, remembering. And as he casually reached for his glass without meeting her eyes, the same gesture he had made years ago before walking away from a girl he never thought he'd see again, Ava felt something shift, not anger, not pain, but clarity, the kind that settles in when the past and present collide in a way that can no longer be ignored. And for the first time that night, she didn't move to serve him, didn't lower her gaze, didn't disappear the way people like him expected her to, because invisibility had never protected her. It had only delayed this moment, the moment where silence was no longer the safer choice. And somewhere between the soft music and the skyline glowing like a million quiet witnesses, Ava Johnson finally decided that this time, he would see her. The air did not change all at once. It shifted slowly, like a tide pulling back before anyone realized the water was gone. And Ava Johnson felt every second of it as she set the bottle down with quiet precision, her fingers steady even as something deeper began to rise. Not anger, not fear, but something far more controlled. The kind of calm that comes when a story you have lived through decides it is finally ready to be told. And across from her, Daniel Whitmore continued speaking about margins and timelines, his voice smooth, practiced, the voice of a man who had never needed to repeat himself to be heard. And yet he had no idea that the most important conversation of his life was about to begin without his permission, because 8 years ago he had stood in a lobby just as polished as this room, floors gleaming, security guards posted like statues, and he had glanced at a young woman holding a resume like it was her last chance. And in that single glance he had made a decision. Quick, efficient, forgettable, the kind of decision powerful people make every day without ever thinking twice. But for Ava it had not been forgettable. It had been defining. It had been the moment everything shifted, the moment doors closed before she could even reach for the handle. And now here he was again, the same man, the same presence, the same quiet dismissal wrapped in expensive fabric. Only this time the girl he overlooked had become the woman standing directly in front of him. And she was no longer waiting for permission to exist in his world. And when Daniel finally reached for his glass, expecting it to be there without effort, his hand paused midair because the glass had not moved. And for the first time that evening his eyes lifted, not fully, not yet, just enough to notice that something was different, that the rhythm he controlled had been interrupted. And Ava met that half-glance without hesitation. Her posture, straight, her expression unreadable, holding his attention in a way no one in that room had managed all night. And there was a flicker, brief but real, of confusion crossing his face, because powerful men notice disruptions before they understand them. And this was a disruption he could not immediately explain. And in that suspended second, between expectation and awareness, Between who he thought she was and who she actually had become, the past pressed closer to the surface, not as a memory for him, but as a truth for her, something that had been waiting patiently, quietly, for the exact moment when it could no longer be ignored. And Ava understood something then with absolute clarity, that this was not about revenge, not about proving him wrong, but about making something undeniable, something he could not dismiss or forget the way he had before. And so instead of stepping back, instead of fading into the background like she had been trained to do, she leaned slightly forward, just enough to break the invisible line that separated people like him from people like her, and in a voice calm enough to blend with the music yet sharp enough to cut through everything else, she said, "Mr. Whitmore, do you remember the lobby on Franklin Street? The night it rained so hard the sidewalks looked like mirrors, and the room did not react, not yet. But something inside Daniel Whitmore did, something small, almost imperceptible, like a crack forming beneath a surface that had always appeared unbreakable." Daniel did not answer right away, not because he did not hear her, but because something in the way she said it refused to be ignored, the kind of detail that does not belong in small talk, the kind that pulls at memory whether you want it to or not. And his fingers, still hovering near the untouched glass, tightened just slightly as his eyes finally lifted all the way to meet hers, really meet them this time, not as a passing glance, not as a background check, but as a question he could not yet form. And for a brief second the room around them seemed to dim, not in light, but in importance, as if everything else had quietly stepped back to make space for something neither of them had planned. And Ava held his gaze without hesitation, her expression calm, steady. The kind of calm that is built over years of being overlooked and choosing not to break. And she watched as recognition tried to find its way through layers of certainty inside him, layers built from years of decisions made quickly, efficiently, without emotional cost. And yet this moment refused to follow those rules, because it was not about numbers or negotiations. It was about something far less controlled, something human, something he had long trained himself to move past. And the more he looked at her, the more something felt familiar in a way that made him uncomfortable, not obvious, not clear, just enough to disrupt the clean lines of his thoughts, like seeing a reflection that does not quite match what you expect. And he leaned back slightly in his chair, buying himself a second, maybe two, the way he did in meetings when he needed time to calculate. But this was not something that could be calculated, because Ava was not presenting data, she was presenting history. And history does not ask for permission to be remembered. It simply arrives when it chooses, and she saw it in his eyes, that subtle shift, the moment when confidence meets uncertainty, when control begins to slip just enough to be noticed, and she did not rush it, did not push, because she understood something he did not yet fully grasp, that this moment belonged to her now, not to his timeline, not to his expectations. And so she continued, her voice still even, still measured, but carrying a weight that settled deeper with every word. "You were standing under the awning, dry, checking your phone, and I was holding a folder that was already falling apart from the rain." And Daniel's breath slowed, not visibly, not in a way anyone else in the room would catch, but enough for him to feel it, because now the image was forming, not complete, not clear, but present, like a scene trying to load in his mind from a file he did not realize he had saved. And his jaw tightened just slightly as a flicker of that night began to surface, the sound of rain hitting pavement, the reflection of streetlights on wet concrete, the faint memory of someone speaking to him when he had somewhere else to be, somewhere more important. And suddenly the question was no longer whether he remembered, but whether he wanted to. And Ava saw that hesitation, that quiet resistance, and she knew exactly what it meant, because forgetting had always been easier for him, but remembering had never been optional for her. And as the silence stretched just a second longer than comfortable, just enough to be felt, she took one small step closer, not aggressive, not confrontational, just enough to close the distance between past and present. And in that space, with the city lights watching, and the room holding its breath without knowing why, Daniel Whitmore began to realize that whatever this was, it was not going away. The silence did not break. It deepened, stretching across the polished table like a shadow that no one else could see. And Daniel Whitmore felt it settle into his chest in a way that numbers never had, because this was not pressure from a deal or a deadline. This was something far less predictable, something that did not respond to strategy or control, and as Ava stood there, steady and unshaken, he realized with growing clarity that she was not asking a question, she was opening a door he had walked past years ago without even turning his head, and now that door was standing right in front of him, refusing to close, and the image in his mind sharpened just enough to unsettle him. The rain, the awning, the faint outline of a young woman speaking while he checked his phone, dismissing her without thought, because at the time it had been nothing, just another interruption in a day full of important things, and yet here she was, carrying that moment as if it had weight, as if it had mattered. And that was the part he struggled to understand, because in his world moments only mattered if they changed something measurable, something visible, but Ava's presence was proof that something had changed, something he had not tracked, not recorded, not even acknowledged, and his voice, when it finally came, was quieter than before, not weak, but uncertain in a way he rarely allowed himself to sound. "I meet a lot of people," he said, the words careful, almost defensive, as if stating a fact could restore the balance he felt slipping, and Ava nodded slightly, not in agreement, but in recognition, because she had expected that answer. She had lived long enough with this memory to know exactly how it would be received, and she did not challenge him directly, did not raise her voice or demand acknowledgement, because this was not about forcing him to remember, it was about making it impossible for him to keep forgetting. And so she let the moment breathe for just a second longer before speaking again, her tone unchanged, her presence unwavering. "I know," she said, her eyes never leaving his. "But that night, I only needed one person to notice, and..." Something in that sentence landed differently, not loud, not dramatic, but precise, like a key turning slowly in a lock that had not been opened in years, and Daniel felt it. That subtle shift from uncertainty to discomfort, because now the memory was no longer abstract. It was beginning to take shape, to attach itself to meaning, and meaning was harder to ignore, harder to dismiss. And around them the room continued its quiet rhythm, conversations rising and falling, glasses touching lightly. A waiter passing by without looking twice, completely unaware that at this table something far more significant than any deal was unfolding. And Daniel's gaze remained fixed on Ava, searching, not for confirmation, but for context, for something that could explain why this moment felt heavier than it should, and in that search there was something new, something unfamiliar, not authority, not control, but attention, the kind of attention he had not given her before, and Ava saw it, recognized it, instantly, because she had spent years understanding the difference between being seen and being acknowledged, and this, finally, was the beginning of acknowledgement. And as the city lights shimmered behind them like distant echoes of a life neither of them could fully step away from, Ava took a slow breath, steadying the moment, preparing to take it one step further, because she knew that recognition was not a single instant. It was a process, one that unfolded piece by piece, and Daniel, to him, he began to notice details that did not belong to a stranger, the steadiness in her eyes, the absence of hesitation in her posture, the quiet confidence of someone who was not trying to prove anything anymore, and it unsettled him in a way he could not immediately explain, because it suggested a history he had not accounted for, a consequence that had unfolded without his awareness. And Ava let that realization build, did not rush to fill the silence, because she understood that recognition, real recognition, needed space to form, and when she finally spoke again, her voice carried not accusation, but clarity. "I waited outside that building for 3 hours, she said, each word placed carefully. "I had one interview left that day, and I thought it might change everything." And Daniel's expression shifted, subtle but undeniable, because now the memory was no longer just an image, it had context, it had weight, and with that weight came the uncomfortable truth that what had been insignificant to him had not been insignificant to her, and he felt it, that slow tightening in his chest. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, just enough to make him aware that something he had dismissed without thought had lingered in someone else's life far longer than he ever intended. And Ava watched that shift without satisfaction, without bitterness, simply observing the process she had anticipated for years, because she had replayed that night more times than she could count, not out of anger, but out of necessity, trying to understand how a single moment could redirect an entire path. And now she was watching the other side of that moment come to life. Watching the man who had walked away begin to realize that he had left something behind, something he had never bothered to see. And Daniel finally spoke again, slower this time, less certain. "What exactly are you saying?" he asked, not as a challenge, but as someone trying to piece together a story he had not known he was part of. And Ava held his gaze, unflinching, because this was the point where everything connected, where past and present aligned in a way that could not be undone. And she answered him without raising her voice, without changing her tone, because the truth did not need volume to be heard. "You told me I did not belong inside," she said, her words steady, "and I believed you." And that sentence landed heavier than anything before it, not because of how it was said, but because of what it revealed, the quiet admission that his words had not just passed through her life, they had shaped it. And Daniel felt it settle in. That realization that influence does not require intention, that power, even when used casually, leaves an imprint. And for the first time in a long time, he did not have an immediate response, did not have a strategy or a correction or a way to redirect the moment. Because this was not a negotiation he could win. This was not a situation he could control. And Ava, standing just within reach yet entirely beyond his authority, represented something he had not prepared for, the human cost of a moment he had never counted. And as the quiet continued to stretch between them, no longer empty, but full of meaning, Daniel Whitmore began to understand that whatever he had thought that night was, in fact, something far more permanent than he had ever allowed himself to consider. The words did not fade after she said them. They lingered, settling into the space between them with a weight that could not be ignored. And Daniel Whitmore felt something unfamiliar begin to take hold. Not pressure, not fear, but accountability, quiet and steady, the kind that does not announce itself but refuses to leave once it arrives. And for the first time that night, he was not thinking about the deal on the table or the people watching from the edges of the room. He was thinking about a version of himself he had not revisited in years. A version that moved quickly, spoke casually, and never stayed long enough to see what his words left behind. And now that version was standing in front of him, reflected not in a mirror, but in the calm, unwavering presence of the woman he had once dismissed. And Ava did not rush to fill the silence that followed, because she understood that this moment was not about what she would say next. It was about what he was finally beginning to understand. And she watched as the certainty that had defined him all evening gave way to something more uncertain, more human, as if the ground beneath his confidence had shifted just enough to make him aware of it. And when he finally spoke, his voice was lower, less polished. "I did not know," he said, the words simple, almost instinctive, as if they were meant to explain something that could not truly be explained. And Ava nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, because she had expected that too, not as an excuse, but as a reflection of how easily people in his position move through moments without recognizing their impact. And she responded with the same calm clarity she had carried from the beginning. "You did not need to know," she said, her tone even. "That is the point." And the simplicity of that truth landed deeper than any accusation could have, because it stripped away the idea that intention mattered more than outcome. And Daniel felt it settle in. That realization that the absence of awareness did not erase the presence of consequence. And for a moment he looked away, not to escape, but to process, his gaze drifting toward the city. Lights beyond the glass. Lights that once represented control, expansion, certainty, and now seemed distant, almost detached from the moment unfolding inside the room. And when he looked back at her, there was something different in his expression, not authority, not dominance, but recognition, not fully formed, not complete, but undeniable. And Ava saw it. The shift she had waited for, not out of need, but out of closure. Because this was never about changing him. It was about making sure he could no longer remain unchanged. And as the quiet returned, no longer tense but steady, Daniel took a slow breath, the kind that signals a decision forming. And for the first time that night, he was not trying to control the outcome. He was trying to understand it. And in that effort, however small, something fundamental had already begun to change. Not in the room, not in the deal, but in him and Ava, standing exactly where she needed to be, realized that the moment she had carried for 8 years had finally reached its turning point, not with noise, not with confrontation, but with the quiet, undeniable weight of truth. The room did not know what had changed, but it felt it, in the slight hesitation of a conversation nearby, in the way a glass was set down a little more carefully than before, in the subtle shift of attention that happens when something unspoken begins to carry weight. And Daniel Whitmore sat there, no longer leading the moment, no longer directing the pace, because for the first time in a long time, he was not the one in control of the narrative unfolding in front of him. And that realization did not come with panic. It came with something quieter, something heavier. The awareness that control had never truly included this kind of truth, and Ava Johnson remained exactly where she was, steady, composed, not pressing forward, not stepping back, because she understood that this next part did not belong to her alone. It belonged to what he chose to do with what he now knew. And Daniel's gaze stayed on her, not searching anymore, not questioning, but acknowledging, the kind of acknowledgement that comes when denial is no longer an option. And he straightened slightly in his chair, not out of habit, but as if trying to meet the moment at its level. And when he spoke, his voice carried something new, something unpolished but real. "You waited," he said, not as a question, but as a realization spoken out loud. And Ava gave a small nod, her expression unchanged, because she had already said everything that mattered, and now it was up to him to understand the rest. And Daniel exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that signals the beginning of acceptance, not of the situation, but of his place within it. And he looked down for just a second. Not had taken shape, something that would not be recorded in contracts or headlines, but would remain, in the way certain truths do, long after the room had emptied and the night had ended. And Ava watched him with the same calm presence she had held from the beginning, not expecting anything, not waiting for an apology or a correction, because she had not come here for that. She had come here to close something that had been left open for too long, and whether or not he understood it completely was no longer the point. The point was that he could not unknow it now. And Daniel Whitmore, a man who had built his life on never missing what mattered, finally understood that the most significant moment of this night had nothing to do with the deal in front of him, but with the quiet, undeniable truth standing just across the table, waiting not to be acknowledged, but simply to be seen. There, with the weight of 8 years finally resting where it belonged, not in the past, not in a forgotten corner of his memory, but in the present, fully seen, fully understood. And Ava Johnson stood before him no longer as someone waiting to be acknowledged, but as someone who had already moved beyond the need for it. And that difference, that quiet distance between needing recognition and no longer requiring it, was something Daniel could feel but not yet fully grasp, because in his world,